Afternoon, everyone. We'd like to welcome you back for our next session, please. So we've got two more sessions this afternoon before we break for the day. We're taking a little bit of a change of direction in this session from the previous session, which of course was that fascinating exploration of social investment and all of the different things that would mean. We're moving now onto a session on trade, dealing with trade in a divided world. This is going to be a fantastic session, I can assure you. We've got the A team of panelists right here in front of you. Our first speaker on this topic is going to be Vangelis Vitalis. He is the Deputy Secretary, Trade and Economic at Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He's a hugely experienced government official, and we're really delighted to welcome him along to provide some input into this panel. Our second speaker is Mikic. Mia, her affiliation is listed as University of Waikato, but she has much broader experience than that. Indeed, until 2021, she was the Director of Trade, Innovation and Investment at UNESCAP in Bangkok. So huge experience, particularly in the Asian region. And we're delighted that she's a research associate with us here at Waikato University and really helping to build our trade policy expertise. And our third panellist is my colleague, Professor Jason Mika. Jason has particular expertise in Indigenous trade. He's a fairly new member of our staff at Waikato Management School, but he has really added a huge amount to what we're able to do in this area of trade policy, particularly with respect to Indigenous trade. And I'd have to say that he's very much leading the frontiers in that area, both nationally in New Zealand, but also internationally. So we really have got a wonderful team of panellists. I'm going to move straight over and ask them to have their 5 minutes of opening remarks. No need to clap after each one, thanks. We'll go straight into the discussion afterwards, and I know that you'll want to, but you can save your applause for the end. Don't forget those Slido questions, send them through, and we'll be working through those once they've had the initial remarks. Vangelis.
Thank you very much. So look, what a great topic, trade in a divided world, which I would say is trade in a dividing world. And I want to speak in three parts. First of all, to sketch some of the context and to leave you with the thought that the golden weather as it was for New Zealand trade policy is well and truly over. The second is to describe what our response is and the strategy that we're going to adopt now to deal with this dividing world and navigate the end of that golden weather. And then finally, I want to make some concluding remarks, in particular to leave you with the thought that we have a plan, that we have agency internationally, even as a small state, and as a trading nation, it is critical that we deliver on those elements that I'm going to describe. So in terms of that context, some of you may have heard me speak before about the golden weather period for New Zealand trade policy, rules that were enforceable, that brought agricultural trade into the rules-based trading system, protectionism declining, and a strong social licence, both in New Zealand and internationally, supportive of trade policy as a key driver of economic growth. Those assumptions are no longer ones that we can hold. Protectionism is rising. The rules are now fragmented, broken, and many of the big powers are flouting those rules quite deliberately. And the social licence, if you're in any doubt about how challenging the social licence is today, just look at what's happening in Europe right now. So those challenges that we face are now compounded by the geopolitics. We have the tensions between the major powers. Even the Pacific has now become contested space in a way that we've not been used to globally. We have a key challenge to face, which I've never faced in my career, which is we don't have US leadership in trade policy anymore. And we have a much more muscular China. And if you're in any doubt about how muscular China can be, just ask Australian wine exporters, Australian barley exporters, Australian coal exporters, and Australian crayfish exporters who were cut off overnight because of a perceived misstep by the Australian government. So that is a fundamental, non-trivial change to the way we've thought about the world. And on top of that, we have, of course, the existential challenge of climate change. We have increasing concern in that social license space about the environmental effects of trade, the impact on trade and labour standards. All of these things are part of the contextual environment that we're going to need to think about and how we navigate that. And that brings me to the response. So we know that the new government has given us a target, a clear objective of doubling exports over the next 10 years. And we're gearing up across the economy, because it's not going to be just something that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs can deliver by itself. It's going to require a full economy press to deliver on that very significant objective. But there are some key things that my organisation is going to be focused on, 5 things. The first is going to be, we're going to be very focused on supporting New Zealand exporters internationally to break down these emerging protectionist barriers that are emerging. So non-tariff barriers will be a key focus of the work that my group does as we take this forward. And we know there are literally billions of dollars locked up. A recent estimate suggested that in the Asia-Pacific region alone, there are more than $16 billion worth of non-tariff barriers affecting New Zealand's agricultural trade only. We're also going to get better at utilising the trade agreements that we negotiate. We're going to make sure that the $1.8 billion of additional exports that the EU-New Zealand FTA is supposed to deliver, that we actually capitalise on that. Because we do know that 40% of a trade agreement's value can be lost through poor implementation. So we're very focused on that piece as well. And we're going to be negotiating agreements. The government's given us a clear objective of negotiating a free trade agreement with India. That's clearly going to be a major objective, and that's going to require a cross-government strategy, the involvement of business and other communities and civil society to find a way into that negotiation with a key partner. And we know that Australia has already struck a deal. We know that there are competitiveness effects there in sheep meat, in wine, in horticulture, that we need to ensure that we can catch up to that. We're also going to be working in the institutions across the region and internationally, the OECD, APEC, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, where both India and the United States are present. Those are the norm-building institutions that support the establishment of the kinds of rules that we need to see re-emerge after this sort of period of fragmentation and tension that we currently see. And the final area that we work on is the architecture. That's about the World Trade Organization, that's about CPTPP and the expansion of CPTPP. So last year was a tremendous year for New Zealand. We were in the chair. The United Kingdom has now joined the agreement. And this year, we're going to be looking at who else we can bring into the agreement. So CPTPP becomes a vital part of our architecture. And this graph is designed, this is my only graph, this graph is designed to show you what our strategy is here. China, critical economic partner. But it is worth remembering that we actually export more to CPTPP partners. And now that the United Kingdom has joined CPTPP, there's an even greater number of our exports go to CPTPP plus the UK. If you add in ASEAN, which is essentially a story of Indonesia, then you've got an even greater. You can see what we're trying to do here is hedge our risk, is manage that by negotiating these trade agreements that create new opportunities for business. And we hope that those businesses will take a look at those opportunities and think about how their own diversification risk management needs to proceed. That brings me to my conclusion, which is, yes, the golden weather is well and truly over for New Zealand trade policy, but that does not mean that we are helpless in the face of the big challenges that we face out there. We have agency. And the key to that agency is not only the cross-agency, the cross-economy work that we do, but internationally. We need to be in the small rooms where the big decisions are made. There's 164 members of the World Trade Organization, but when the crunch moment comes, the Director General will call together 15 to 20 of those members. New Zealand has to be in that group. We do that by having a brand of being creative, constructive, interested, and interesting. That's the critical part that gets us in that room. And we've already had a success. Minister Macleay has been appointed as the Vice Chair of the WTO Ministerial that starts in about a week and a half. That's a critical moment. It means we'll be in the room. That is how we defend and protect our national interest, and that is how we are going to achieve the very stretch goals that the government has presented us with. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for that intro. Mia?
Sorry. Well, hello everyone. If you need to define 2024 and you don't want to do it in terms of Taylor Swift era concerts, then you will define it in terms of uncertainty. And wherever you look, whether it is in terms of what was just mentioned, the outcome of the ministerial conference number 13, or with the election that are coming up in so many countries that are actually taking 40% of global GDP, the social resentments and unrests that we were speaking about before, it is uncertainty. But what is not uncertain is that our world is getting divided, it is getting fragmented. And it is getting fragmented in a very fast way, in a quick way, the way that we really did not see it coming. And when you look at the science of that, I think trade is definitely the best tool through which that fragmentation is shown. So by tracking, for example, the trade flows that are happening between the countries in the political bloc and the countries between the blocs, the 2023 has been noted as the slowdown in trade, but the trade was falling much quicker, actually twice as quick between the countries belonging to different blocs than in the countries that belong to the same bloc. Then what was even more visible was that trade had issues, or the trade flows were difficult in so-called sensitive sectors for national security, chemicals, different type of IT, machinery, as well as low carbon technology. What we also noted was that FDI was segmenting with regards to these political blocs. US-China, the trade did not fall as much as some people expected, but indeed China is not anymore the largest trading partner of US, it is Mexico. And so we saw many trade flows being rerouted, not anymore going directly from China to the destinations, because China was the largest trading partners of most of the countries in the world, but are now rerouted through various other Southeast Asian countries, some of the Eastern European, Central Asian countries, and of course some of the Latin American countries. What we also noted is that the spending on military has increased. And of course, this is what creates this chilling feeling in the world. And I was recently listening to the head of IMF, who was commenting on her experiences from the Cold War #1 that we had from the 50s to the 1980s. I would say in the quotation marks, privileged to live through part of that Cold War as well. But she said, believe me, it was cold behind the other side of the curtain. And I can tell you that it was. So we really need to think very carefully about this fragmentation and to think about the likelihood that the world will be, for the longer term, entering another Cold War #2. What is different now, as opposed to last century Cold War, is that nowadays countries are, through the global value chains, much more actually connected, to the cost of decoupling, and the fragmentation will be higher. But also is that the certainty about who is belonging to which bloc is not as high as it was in the last century, and it is movable and shiftable. And so that increases the cost even further. Now, let me, in the remaining, I hope 2 minutes or 1 minute, just address the topic of trade policy. Because trade policy is also changing as the world is changing. And I think many people still would try to believe that trade policy is about increasing exports and reducing imports. And that we have, for everything else, we have a MasterCard. But it's not, right? Trade was never about actually just increasing trade flows or reducing some trade flows. It was a long time ago called engine of growth, creating different and better living standards for people. And then through time and in the current time, we are actually seeing it as an instrument of driving different goals or values than just increasing trade flows. It is a driver of a different social, ideological, and if you wish, strategic issues. We now talk about multi-purpose trade policy, and it is the trade policy that is now sort of linked with having to deliver the objectives that are related to improving living standards of various marginalized groups, or delivering national security, or helping with mitigating climate change. So how do we do that? It's a complex thing. We obviously cannot only rely on just picking the same trading partners, the same trading products that we have, or the way we trade. We have to change the way we do things. And I think in the rest of our panel, we'll be discussing how we can do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mia. Jason?
Kia ora tātou. I guess for me, my focus, my interest is really around, I can't tell the weather, so I don't know if it's golden or not, but when Vangelis mentioned muscular China, I was thinking of Arnold Schwarzenegger versus Lou Ferrigno, and I guess for me, my focus is really around Indigenous trade and the opportunity for Māori and Indigenous firms and communities to participate in trade and to benefit from it. So if we're thinking about expanding trade within the international community with new and different partners as well as existing partners, then my focus is on how can we ensure that Māori enterprises are right there, participating in those opportunities to deliver what they have to offer the world in terms of goods and services, but in a way that makes sense for Māori and Indigenous firms, using Māori and Indigenous values, knowledges, and practices that make sense for our whenua, for our lands, our wai, our waters, and our communities, our whānau. And I was just really pleased to hear some of the kōrero this morning around investing in whānau potential. Because if we're going to invest in Indigenous trade and international trade and its expansion generally, what difference does that make for whānau? How is whānau well-being improved as a result of us engaging in international trade with anyone? And how do we know? And who knows? And what difference does that make? So those are some really important questions for me. My focus is at the smaller level, is around the small businesses, the small to medium Māori enterprises. And I have to acknowledge all of the Māori and Indigenous business leaders who have really carved a pathway forward for us to participate in international trade. Tracy Haupapa from Federation of Māori Authorities, Ngā Hiwi Tomoana from the Iwi Chairs, also Chris Inslee from Te Taumata, now chaired by Hone McGregor of Waikato Incorporation, and also have to acknowledge our whānau who are fighting for Māori and Indigenous rights, the protection of Māori and Indigenous knowledge in terms of the products, the services, the processes that that are part of international trade. And that's Ngātuki Whakarururanga, is one of the organisations who is leading that work. Pita Tipene, and also Moana Maniapoto. So for me, it's a privilege really to contribute and build on all of that work and to work with them. One of the ways in which we're doing that is engaging in research. So last year we put in a bid to MB. So this is your money and mine, taxpayers' money, an Endeavour research program called Tau Hoko Hoko. Now, Tau Hoko Hoko means trade in the Māori language, and to exchange, to give and take. And we were very fortunate to receive $14.9 million over 5 years, plus GST, takes it up to about 17 mil. So what we're trying to understand there is how we can indigenize trade policy. And let me say this, OECD, World Trade Organization, APEC, ASEAN, all trying to figure out, well, what is Indigenous trade and how can we engage with it and support it? And all of these countries internationally, they have different relationships with their Indigenous communities, their Indigenous peoples, and they're looking to us, you know, for what are we doing? And so it's really important that we do a good job on that research program. It has one main focus. How do we, I guess, enable mana motu hake, you know, which is tribal autonomy, Māori autonomy, through Indigenous trade so that our whānau are better off, is well-being. So it's not enough just to do more business internationally and sell more goods and services, but what difference does that make for whānau well-being? Waiora, Māori word for well-being, huanga, the Māori word for benefits. So how does trade translate in terms of benefits and well-being for our whānau, but also climate change, climate resilience? How do we look after our whenua, our wai, and our communities in terms of what's going on with Papatūānuku? So some big expectations on that research program. Luckily, we've got people like Anna and Mia who are part of the research program. So there's three key aims of it. One is indigenising trade policy and just trying to understand, just imagine, and this is the way I explain it, just imagine that we lock ourselves at the marae for a week and we think about what would trade policy look like if we designed it from a Māori and Indigenous worldview. And then come out the other end after a wānanga, what would it look like? Would it look like what we have now or something else, something better? And the second research aim is measuring Indigenous trade. So one of the challenges of Indigenous trade is you can't see it in the data. We've got a bit of data thanks to Stats NZ around Māori Authority exports, but it's really hard to see Indigenous trade data inside the trade that's done globally. And so Anna introduced us to her mate. Her mate's over in Purdue University. So anyone wants to do economic modelling on trade, they go to Purdue University to a database called GTAP. So GTAP is part of our research program, help us to see the Indigenous trade data inside Aotearoa, but also other countries as well. Third aim is enabling Indigenous trade. And this is the area that most interests me in terms of supporting our Māori and Indigenous firms to do business internationally and to be successful in doing so. And underpinned, the whole thing is underpinned by mātauranga Māori, Indigenous knowledge and how we can integrate that in what we do. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Jason. Thank you very much to our, you can see what wealth of expertise we've got here and some kind of worrying notes of pessimism there, but it was good to add on that optimistic note that we're going to make some real progress in the Indigenous trade area at least. The question I'd like to start with is actually a question that I think all of the panellists will perhaps like to address, perhaps in different ways. If the world is getting more fragmented, which certainly Mia and Vangelis, you were talking about this, does it mean that we need to collaborate better within New Zealand? And in particular, a sub-question, is there a role for government-industrial collaboration on some sort of industrial policy? And this came through in the agricultural session earlier on today as well, and we didn't get to really dig into the picking winners in the industrial policy there, but I'm not sure if our trade experts want to comment on that. But certainly, do we need this more collaborative approach in New Zealand? given that we've got such a fragmented and increasingly fragmented world. Mia, you're going to start, are you?
Well, look, I wish I could say, well, forget about this fragmented world and just enjoy nice collaboration within New Zealand. Unfortunately, New Zealand depends on being in the global markets. So we need to find a way to operate in the fragmented world. And I think what Vangelis was talking about, the way we're responding to this is really a good way. We need to remain present in the multilateral fora, particularly WTO, and we need to ensure that our creativity and I think the way we approach collaboration through selecting the countries that, and I hate to use the term like-minded, but that have the shared values and shared objectives as New Zealand with respect to how to use trade policy for improving quality of growth rather than just quantity of growth, and collaborate more through that and show them successes at that. And as we have seen through various examples that already New Zealand has taken part in, other countries pick up and then they want to join us. So this definitely remains the main strategy, but of course we need to work better internally. And I think strengthening domestic economy and improving competitiveness, and we have heard so many things, great things this morning about what needs to be done really to strengthen the environment in which firms operate, right, is one big task, right? Including also not to just rely on tax policies to fix everything, but actually to invest differently in productivity, in technology, in how do we do business. And that is two track that we have to take. So internationally and domestically that we will basically prosper.
Kia ora, if I can just add to that, I guess the thing for me is when you think about the Māori economy, last time we measured it, Bill measured it, it was 68 billion, but it's still small. And there's still a need for Māori enterprises in particular to collaborate, and in different industries and sectors, collaboration, clustering amongst Māori enterprises, whether that's in the primary sector, fishery, seafood, and other areas, food and beverage. That's definitely a strategy for the Māori economy, because collectively, even at the Māori economy level, we're too small. So we've got to collaborate. Now, the other side of collaboration is collaboration between Māori and non-Māori enterprises within industries, in which Aotearoa is really good. Our agri-tech, our agri-business, digital services is coming along. And so all of our industry and business leaders who are leading those firms need to think about, well, who are the Māori and Indigenous firms within our cluster, within our industry? Are they part of the direction and the effort that needs to go on in terms of working together across industries and within industries to compete globally? So I think a huge effort in terms of collaboration is needed.
Thanks. Yeah, great question. Maybe to make two observations, one about the domestic and one about the international. On the domestic side, I certainly see the value of collaboration. I'm a little bit wary of things that start to edge into subsidies and so on. I mean, we've got a terrific reputation internationally of not going down that path and having learned some bitter lessons from the 70s and 80s. So I think where I could see that greater collaboration is certainly around the infrastructure piece. So the transport system, the delivery to the ports, have we thought enough about how that connectivity is working? And is that really doing enough? If we're going to set this, if we're going to achieve this doubling export target, is the infrastructure really fit for purpose? And that, I think, is one of the things that we really do need to focus on, is getting that right. The other thing, and I've deliberately put this in the domestic economy piece, is have we done enough with the single economic market with Australia? We often take that simply for granted. Here is this fantastic single economic market that we have with Australia. What is its future? We've just had its 40-year anniversary last year. What do we want it to look like in 10, 20, 30 years? And if you look out across the world in this divided world, you see an ASEAN regional economic community emerging over the next 10 to 20 years. What's our relationship going to be to that? And I don't mean New Zealand's relationship, I mean the single economic markets relationship. What are the things that we've learned so well out of the work that we've done with Australia, mutual recognition, not creating new super infrastructure a la Europe, but instead this very practical, focused way that has driven the growth in our two economies. Is there scope to think about the relationship that we're going to have with the emerging ASEAN regional economic community? That's my domestic observation. My international observation is that collaboration piece, including with Maori, a key part of that happens on shore is understanding better where the interest lies, both the commercial and the sort of the protection of Indigenous knowledge, data sovereignty questions. And if you look at what we did with the EU in the EU Free Trade Agreement, you see both elements at play. The better information that we had because of our engagement with Maori, and all of the people that Jason mentioned are the people that we work with all the time, and I personally speak to them myself. That information that we received meant that we got much better outcomes for the Maori economy, but also for the New Zealand economy. The elimination of the tariff, the 22% tariff on mussels into Europe, meant that for the first time when we get this agreement enters into force, for the first time New Zealand mussel exporters will be competing for the first time ever on a level playing field with our main competitor. At the moment, we account for about 11% of the EU market on mussels. The Chileans dominate exports. Nearly 83% of the market is taken up by the Chileans. They've had 9 years of a free trade agreement with the EU. For the first time, we will have a level playing field, and I expect there'll be a real explosion in that trade there. But it's not just, as you've said, it's not just about the commercial aspect. So if you think about what we've tried to do in the digital chapter with the EU, the additional protections built in to protect Indigenous data, Maori data sovereignty, a real concern that the Waitangi Tribunal pointed out to us that we've looked to incorporate in the thing. So that offshore piece and how we project ourselves, those two pieces coming together, I think are critical elements of the way in which we need to think about the future.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move to a more specific question on trade agreements, and you can see that our foreign affairs are in very capable of hands with people like Vangelis leading our negotiations. But here's a challenging question perhaps for you on negotiations. Heard a comment, slim but doable, to an FTA with India. But an FTA with the US is off the table for New Zealand. Thoughts on this? And also thoughts on getting the US to come to the table in terms of being a more genuinely open trading partner, irrespective of trade agreements. Maybe I'll start with you, Vangelis, and you can offer any comments that you'd like to, and then we can turn to our other panelists.
Okay, so I mean, I did talk about the India FTA, and first of all, there's an opportunity there. And if you think about the graph that I tried to show there about how we build resilience and manage our risk, India is clearly a critical partner in that space. We know that they can do free trade agreements. They've done a free trade agreement with Australia. I mentioned that there are some competitiveness effects, so we are going to need to address that. So I absolutely do think that's doable. We need to find the right way to advance this with India, and that requires a cross-government strategy. It's not going to be just the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's going to be the Trade Minister, the Science and Innovation Minister. It's going to be a cross-ministry piece led by the Prime Minister that's going to get us into that frame. So I absolutely think that that's something that we need to be driving for and be advancing as part of our kind of the way in which we want us to look in the very near future. Sorry, your second element was, so that was the India piece?
US.
Oh, the US, yeah. Okay, so there's a very consequential election happening at the end of this year, and so it is very difficult to kind of forecast, and I certainly don't want to do that in this forum. But no matter what it is, we know that the United States is a critical partner of ours, and even absent an FTA, I would note that our trade with the United States has continued to expand. It is now I think our second most important market now, notwithstanding the absence of a free trade agreement. There are things that we need to do. It is an objective fact that the United States continues to apply steel and aluminium tariffs against us. It's also an objective fact that we joined a case against the United States in the World Trade Organization. We won that case, but the United States has not brought its regime into compliance, sadly. So we are in that world that is going to be challenging, but we do have touch points. And the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, I think, is a critical enabler. It keeps the United States in the region, engaged. We're part of that process. And regardless of how the election outcome comes, it is absolutely in our interest that the United States is engaged in the region, that we find ways to connect. And for me, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is the way in which we need to think about that. It does take time, and we know that because it took more than a decade for us to transform the P4 agreement into the TPP, which the United States joined. Sadly, they withdrew, and then we have CPTPP, so it is a case of incremental, strategic incrementalism, if you like, in the case of the United States.
Yeah, thanks. Mia,
Sorry,
any
long answer.
No, that was great.
No, I think Vangelis covered it all.
So what we might do is move away from the trade agreements then and move on to globalization. Is it now going backwards or just changing form? Maybe, Jason, I might start with you on this one. Is globalization changing its form? You've talked a lot about these new issues in terms of that we need to be aware of, but do you think globalization is changing its form, or is it just going backwards?
Well, that's a big cope-up. But I actually want to come back to the question just before, if that's all right. International trade, from what I can tell, starts with relationships. If you've got a relationship with someone, then you've got an opportunity to have a dialogue about what is the opportunity before us. And sometimes it may not work out, but at least you've got a relationship of trust and openness. And one of the things around India and also the United States, India has over 500 tribal indigenous tribes registered. They've got a legal system recognizing all these tribes. So India has an indigenous population, and so has the United States. Over 500 federally recognized indigenous tribes with tribal mana motuhake over there. Now, one of the ways in which Māori do business is to establish relationships. So rather than see indigenous people and indigenous trade as a sort of something to add on or add to an agreement, is actually use some of the indigenous ways of forming relationships with people to create an environment where we can have an open discussion. If there's trade missions and trade policy, indigenous people are part of both the design and the delivery of how that occurs. I think that's the point there. About globalisation, we'll see next week.
Actually, Vangelis wanted to add something in on
Okay,
what you were just talking about, and then we'll go back to globalisation.
Yeah, definitely want you to come back to globalisation. I was just going to add the Indigenous Partnership for Economic Cooperation and Trade arrangement that we're in, Canada, Australia and Taiwan are in. That is a fabulous point of engagement with the United States. And at the APEC meeting last year, at the leaders' meeting, there was Ambassador Tai, the US Trade Representative, hosted a meeting with members of the Indigenous Partnership for Economic Cooperation and Trade arrangement. It was the only engagement that she had with a group of non-APEC related structures. And I thought that was a really interesting, that they chose that and that she was involved in that. She spent over an hour and a half with the group. And I think that was a really, and by the way, this is not just government representatives at the table. This also included Tracy Hopapa and Peter Tipene as well. Awesome. Because there's that.
And perhaps that's a nice lead back into that globalisation, because of course this is an area where perhaps we can take things forward. Mia?
Yeah, well,
backwards, or is it just changing?
No, it's actually not going backwards, it's just changing the shape, because we have increase in dependency between the countries, but they are now getting into regional sort of relationships, right? And so I don't think it's really winding down, but it is changing its shape.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you, Vangelis, on this one. I guess it comes from your graph that you put up there, scenario planning. What actually would happen to New Zealand if China shut its door to New Zealand in a practical sense? Where would our exports go? What would happen to our economy?
So, I mean, clearly that would be one of the big fundamental challenges, and we know we've learnt the lessons from Australia's experience, and we've done a lot of work with the Australians to understand how they dealt with that and how they addressed that. I guess the key lesson that came out of the Australian experience was that actually the rules kind of worked. Yes, the door was shut in China, but they then exported, and I take the example of wine, the wine that they used to, so wine was Australia's #1 market because of red wine. China's not a big market for New Zealand wine because we produce largely white wine. What happened was the Australian red found its way into the European and the US markets, and the US and the EU moved their product into China. So the market kind of redistributed, and the rules worked because at that point, the system ensured that the United States was prepared to let this increase from Australia happen and from the EU because they were also moving their own products. So I do think that that's a very important lesson there, is that those relationships, those markets, and the way in which business needs to be thinking about risk, because in the end, the government can't cross-subsidise businesses' risk here. What we've got to do is be saying to people, hey, listen, this is what's happened, and you need to be aware of what's happened, and that is what happened to Australia. People need to be thinking about that, and what we're looking to negotiate is new opportunities for you. So the UK Free Trade Agreement, the EU Free Trade Agreement, the expansion of CPTPP, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, these are all ways of creating optionality for New Zealand businesses internationally. We can't say you need to be here or you need to be here, but we can say, by the way, did you know for the first time, if you're a producer of crayfish in New Zealand, for the first time, you'll be competing on a level playing field in the second most important market in the world for crayfish, and that's Europe. China's #1, Europe's #2. You could never look at Europe because the tariff was 15% and the Canadians were trading in at 0. So you simply couldn't compete because the Canadians are your major competitor. Now, for the first time, you will have that opportunity. What we hope is that fish exporters, crayfish exporters, horticulture exporters, they'll look at that market and think about how their risk should be distributed. But it's not for me to say where people need to be, but it is important that what we do on the government side is we create those opportunities, that optionality. I'm good at long answers.
And a very informative answer that really gets us thinking about this and this intersection of how much we need to target particular industries and so on. Jason, I'm going to come for another question for you, please. What do you see as the key differences between Indigenous trade and mainstream trade? And we'll put quotation marks around the mainstream trade because I think you might be about to mainstream Indigenous trade issues. But what do you see the key differences, and what are the benefits that New Zealand as a whole can harness if we really push the frontiers of Indigenous trade?
Yeah, I guess there's two parts to that. One is, well, maybe three. The first part is culture and identity. So basically identifying as an Indigenous person and your Indigenous values, focusing on things like whanaungatanga. Now, we all have family relationships, we all do, and for Māori, they really focus on whānau relationships. So family relationships really matter, because once you've got those sort of connections, then you have a relationship, you have a responsibility to look after one another and to conduct business. And so one of the key aspects or the differences will be how relationships are formed and the priority that relationships have in terms of conducting business internationally. And some of the trade missions that were conducted earlier on, probably about maybe 10, 15 years ago now, Māori culture was at the forefront of those trade missions to China, to other parts, in terms of sharing culture, sharing values, and getting to know one another through Māori culture, through Māori kai, haka, waiata, karakia. And it wasn't just the Māori that were singing those songs too, Kerry. It was the CEOs of our big companies who really understand the value and importance of engaging as people. So first and foremost is how you form relationships and do business internationally on the basis of Indigenous values. The other side of it is in terms of the products and services which we produce. Our very best products and services, whether that's our kaimoana, our seafood, the entertainment content, or whatever it happens to be, is infused with Māori and Indigenous knowledge. Knowledge of rongoa, knowledge of flora and fauna, but also recognising who owns that stuff and the value of that and where it comes from, so that we can tell our story to the world about our Indigenous and Māori knowledge and products and processes. So it's part of what we actually have to offer the rest of the world, the value that we have here. Probably I guess the third part is I guess the way in which Māori enterprises are formed and why they exist in terms of looking after whānau. So when we think about our businesses and why we do business, why do we do business? It's to feed our whānau. It's to provide for our families in all the ways that we could think of providing for families in terms of their well-being, the benefits for whānau, whether that's in our rural communities or urban centres. So we need to think about a different way in terms of that side of things. So those are some aspects.
Thanks, Jason. Mia, you...
Just adding one little parallel, because it reminds me, Jason, to how we have differentiated between Asian type of doing trade and the Western type of doing trade. And, you know, it was always sort of identified with the American way being transactional and only looking at these, while in Asia, there was a social capital and trust invested and longevity of relationship. And I think that is also applicable very much on how we look in indigenous way of doing trade.
Kia ora.
Thanks. And Mia, I was going to turn to you with another question at this stage as well. Protectionist measures, I know this is something that you give a lot of thought to and feel quite concerned about. Protectionist measures that may be implemented by other nations that can affect New Zealand, whether they're tariffs and non-tariff measures that Vangelis was talking about, or other measures. What's really the way of dealing with these increases in protectionist measures from New Zealand's perspective? Is it trying to push the multilateral approach, or do we have to go with mini deals? How can we deal with this increasingly protectionist era that we seem to be moving into?
Well, that's a difficult question, I think. But look, obviously protectionism affects New Zealand traders because they increase the cost. And you were mentioning $16 billion costs raised through the non-tariff measure. It forces us to trade with different markets, and all of that is more costly and therefore less income domestically. How do we deal with that? Yes, I think you call it gold era. I'm a strong multilateralist. I think it is definitely something that we have to protect and safeguard. But of course, the different type of agreements are valuable as well. Now, if you look at all the agreements that we have signed, right, we have actually covered, I think, 15 agreements, almost in force with 60 countries, counting all the European Union ones. And most of them are quite comprehensive. So what else can you do with these big agreements? Not much. You can't add, when you look into US and India perhaps, then you have closed the book. But what we can explore is what we have been doing, is going a little bit more sectorally or issue-based or measure-based, and try to deal among the countries that are willing to solve these issues through the mutual recognition agreements or mini deals that can help us. Some people would critique that approach because they would say, oh, we will end up with many numbers of little deals. It will be chaotic and it will actually increase the cost of doing trade, but not necessarily, because they can actually be lumped together and they can grow into a bigger deal with more countries, right? And they can serve as a buffer in the period when we do not have any movements in terms of multilateral agreements in these particular areas, like services, for example.
Yeah, can I make it? I agree with you. And the multilateral space is still the best place to deal with subsidies, for example, which are a major form of protection that really depresses the price and then the return for New Zealand exporters. But clearly, in the multilateral scene, we've got some big challenges to face. That's where the free trade agreements come in, and that's where we need to be prepared to enforce our rights there. And it is actually worth remembering that we've always used the World Trade Organization But the World Trade Organization now no longer has a functioning dispute settlement mechanism, so we are forced to look at the free trade agreements. And New Zealand, almost uniquely outside of the North American Free Trade Agreement, the USMCA, we are one of the first countries to test that new system by taking a case against Canada on dairy, on the way in which they've treated our dairy exports through the CPTPP. We are prepared to enforce our rights, use the rules, and we won that case, and Canada is now trying to find a way to make sure it's as compliant as possible, something we're watching very closely. But my point really is about the fact that we are using the mechanisms that exist. Then we need to be prepared to step up and take a case and enforce our rights. We may be a small state, but if you cheat us, we will use these rules that we've negotiated. You know, CPTPP took 5 years to negotiate. We want to actually get the return out of that. But then I think we also need to think creatively about coalitions that we can work together with to push back against barriers. We have, for example, an agreement on pushing back against non-tariff barriers with Chile. What would be wrong with expanding that grouping with a larger number of us who face similar barriers in the horticulture space, in fish and seafood, working together collaboratively to try to drive that? Clearly, Australia is a key partner in that, but again, we're being forced to think creatively about these challenges that our exporters face. And those challenges, by the way, they have a cost, not just on the exporter, but in the return back into our economy. 1 in 4 New Zealand jobs depends on exports. Almost 1 in 3 Maori jobs depends on exports. If you're an exporter, you're earning 14% more than if you're in a non-exporting company. And if you're an exporter, the drive back into productivity back home here is 32%. 32% greater than a non-exporting firm. This does matter. This is critical for us. So if we're seeing people putting up barriers, non-tariff barriers, subsidies, we need to push back against that, and we need to also say to people, and we're prepared to take a case against you. And I tell you what, that does have an impact. We do feel that the fact that we took a case against Canada has sent a message to others that might be thinking, little country, we can just treat them like this. They know that we are prepared to take a case. But those things, they take excellent lawyers, they take resource. This isn't a lobby for more money. Not really.
Excellent trade officials.
But those are that's right. But look, we do need to be thinking about this, but can I make one plea? Businesses that are out there that might be listening to this, you need to let us know if you have a problem. Please don't fester out there thinking you're alone. We can help. There is a cross-agency team. This is not just the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. It's Customs, it's MPI, it's MB, it's TPK. We all work together on this, and we're very, very focused. We've got a clear direction from Minister Macleay that this is an absolute priority to resolve these non-tariff barriers. Take us up on it. Contact us. There's no wrong window. You can go to our website. There's a click there. Register what your problem is, and we will get back to you and we'll develop a strategy to crack it down for you.
That's one of the examples of the internal collaboration that can help.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask a quick question of you, Jason, just because we've had lots of Indigenous trade. There's lots of interest from people on Slido on Indigenous trade, but I'm going to select one of the ones that's come from our high school students, actually, and it's just a very quick question here. Could mainstream New Zealand trade industries collaborate with Indigenous traders? How would this help New Zealand's global image in terms of producing authentic goods and services? So I guess the question, could there be collaboration between Indigenous traders and the rest of New Zealand? Would this help New Zealand's image?
Absolutely, yes. Yes, I mean, there's potential for Māori and non-Māori businesses to collaborate, work together in sectors in which we are both involved, particularly agribusiness, seafood. So the main exports for Māori enterprises at the moment is seafood and dairy products, so agricultural products, and to some extent services as well. Look, I think there's great opportunity for collaboration there, and we've got to sit down as industry leaders, business leaders, and figure out, well, what is the basis for us to do that? What is the basis for us to collaborate and ensure that we're, Māori companies and Māori business leaders are part of those industry bodies, those peak industry bodies that are backing those industries to do well internationally. So that's one aspect. And I think in terms of when we start going overseas on the trade missions, that Māori and non-Māori are there, holding hands, singing together, the waiata, the haka, and part of our presentation to the world about who we are as a people, as a nation. So, kia ora.
And we've got time we've got 20 seconds each for a final wrap-up question. I was thinking of asking them what they felt most optimistic and most pessimistic about, but we've heard such a range of these different things coming through in all of our speakers. I'm just going to give them 20 seconds each to wrap up whatever they would like to wrap up and say whatever they would like to say on this issue of trade in a divided world. Jason, let's start with you. 20 seconds, what do you want to say?
Oh my gosh, 20 seconds. I guess the main thing is to really sort of focus on supporting our Māori and non-Māori businesses to work together when we go internationally to do business using Indigenous and Māori values, forming relationships based on values. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Mia?
I'm wearing a badge that says Women in Trade. And I just want to, on the basis of what you said, what export does to wages and to sort of promotion of better income streams, etc., I want to say that trade is essential and crucial for improving gender equality as well.
Thank you. Look, it is a challenging world out there, and it is really going to be difficult, but I'm actually optimistic about the future. I actually think that we have a good strategy, we have a good plan for the way we're going to do it. We're a small country that has agency. We are very, very focused indeed on the way in which we engage internationally and the rules that we need to support New Zealand businesses. So actually, I'm very positive about the future, and I do think there are really big opportunities out there. We just need to grab them with both hands.
What a wonderful way to end this session that started out with some really difficult issues, this trade in a divided world, things that we're all worried about very deeply. But thank you very much to our panellists for these rich insights across a range of different areas, bringing them together, pushing our understanding forwards. And with that, all that remains is to thank our panellists very much for this session.
Brilliant. Thank you. As a small trading